Now, before we start looking at China, we want to just again reiterate, please like, subscribe, share. Here we're going to go into more depth on China as specifically as we get new data points. We have a report that we're going to put out on Friday that looks at this in even more depth as we start to look at some changing policies and what does that mean overall, and how do we think a potential Biden presidency may change or adjust kind of what's happening at the moment. We'll try to put in what we expect in terms of a Biden presidency versus Trump presidency as we go through the remainder of this, and then we'll try to put something more succinct together as we get more data from the foreign policy and what are the views as we kind of go out. But first, we need to start with where did we begin with China? And one of the things that we've shown before, anyone who knows me knows that I use this chart a lot, or at least this map, because it's not only pretty, but it also gives you an idea of, what is the One Belt, One Road, which then became the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is really the backdrop. So there were two policies that really drove what China was trying to accomplish. And one was the Belt and Road Initiative, which was be able to export the young economy, lock down raw materials, ports, food, really try to create more of a vertical integration to essentially protect themselves, or at least get away from some of the countries that might be able to have financial impact, whether that be Europe or North America. So here you can see, obviously, they've created a very succinct move, and Europe is a part of that, as we've seen with Italy, Russia, and a lot of parts of Eastern Europe. As you can see, the overland, which is mostly just driven by a lot of rail. And then clearly the blue line is really showing you where that the maritime component is and why it's so important when we start looking at fishing and what does that mean for South China Sea, not only economics, but also policy, and what do the politics look like. So this was a big driver. Now then, when we take that and look at Made in China 2025, the idea was to create more industry, and the way to create more industry, but not just industry, but complex industry, refiners, chemicals, petrochemical, technological firms, and then really integrating all of this to create a more succinct within-country components where now they can be more self-reliant within. So Belt and Road Initiative brings in goods, raw materials, semi-finished goods, and then places to export them to. And then Made in China 2025 was turn that into stuff. And now the next level is this dual flow coordination, or as it's been called, the DCS. So when we start looking at the DCS and what does that mean overall, we have to appreciate, okay, well, the dual circulation strategy. What is the dual circulation strategy, and what does that mean as now they've gone from point 1 to point 2 and now point 3, and we'll go through some of the specifics on that DCS policy. But first, we have to appreciate, well, what is the cross-border receipts? As we talked about with the BRI, as we talked about with some of those different backdrops, as we go out into, okay, well, they wanted to export their economy, but as they export the economy, well, what are they exporting? Well, they want to export their yuan currency and essentially take receipts and live within their own economy. And here you can see the increase over time as that policy has been increased, and it's back to essentially all-time highs as you see the CNY usage. Obviously, U.S. dollar is still a core component of it, which is why when we look at U.S. dollar as well as euro, you can see that obviously USD remains the core component, but the CNY is taking more market share. Now, the idea is to increase the market share that continues to increase the market share of CNY, decrease the market share of USD, and get away from some of these the impediments that the U.S. government and U.S. banking system can inflict as you start to look at U.S. dollar movements, which is why when we start looking at Australia and some of the issues that we have, that China now has with Australia, with some of those trade wars, or at least trade complications as they continue to get worse and worse. But they still actually increased imports of iron ore from Australia, but they decreased a lot of other things. So it just is very odd, and it's something that we're starting to get deeper into, because how a President Biden would impact, or how would they look at supporting Australia, and how would those sides look? President Trump has been very specific in terms of, look, China is the elephant in the room. We have to address the issues that have happened. But when we look at a future President Biden, and what is his policy going to look like, you have to go back to President Obama. And when we look at the 8 years of President Obama, you can see the first 4 years were fairly lax to the China, but lax in certain ways, where they did bring up currency manipulation. We did see tariffs. We did see IP being stolen. And that was one of the things that created the first IP Commission report, which was really at the tail end of the first presidency. But then as we went through and we saw the second term, they got much tougher on China, especially in the last, let's call it 2 to 3 years. And as we talked about the lie in the Rose Garden, where we saw some of these islands within the Spratly Islands actually getting, armored and not just being used for science. So those were some of those big pivots, and I don't see a lot of that being changed. And this is why China wants to get away from that, because we still have ways to influence their economy and impact it based on the US dollar trade, which is what they're trying to get away from, which is why they've increased gold and other components to try to mitigate against some of those future problems. And when we talk about some of the future problems, again, we have to really talk about that DCS adjustment. Now, how do you get away from some of the issues? Well, you can break it down into 4 different buckets. Now, this is something that was pulled from Trivium, because I think they did a great job of really highlighting it, where China must control critical technologies and ensure the security of supply chains. Again, BRI, security of supply chains. China must improve efficiency of logistics and lower costs. Again, vertical integration, have more onshore components made in China 2025. It's very much easier to bring in raw materials, create it locally instead of worrying about going abroad. Han said that the party will resolutely prevent income polarization by optimizing the structure of income distribution. So try to enrich everybody within the country itself. And China must protect consumers' rights and build an environment conducive to consumption. That last part is key. The conducive to consumption. So they want to increase total consumption within China, which just means they want to have that full circle. If you look at the U.S., right, the U.S. consumer makes up about 70 to 75% of GDP. If you look at China, at the very beginning, let's call it 2019, exports made up about 38%, as well, I should say exports made up about 38% of GDP. It's now about 19%. So what are they going to do to try to get to the next level? And they want to live within themselves. They want to have that full circle where the raw materials come in, and obviously China has their own raw materials. Raw materials come in, they refine it, they make it, they create it, they invent it, they research and development, and then they buy it themselves. And they can live within the cycle, again, getting away from the US dollar component and focusing more on that CNY or that yuan component that helps them mitigate. But there's obviously a problem. This doesn't happen overnight. And now we've used this chart before. I think it's very important to highlight the semiconductor manufacturing capacity. And clearly China it remains at the low end. Now, this is where they've been focusing. They've been trying to drive more companies to not only invest, but also to build manufacturing to get that semiconductor, because some of the big components of this new policy are really kind of culminating and bringing it home is have robotics, have artificial intelligence, have high technology that you're not only exporting, but you're also consuming at home. And this is why Huawei becomes an issue, because when we'll talk about trade, Huawei is a problem because people are starting to put sanctions because of the backdoor that was dropped into the microchips. And then the other issues in terms of giving them the ability to get into sensitive materials, whether that be U.S. military or German military or European military or NATO or some of our allies that we may have data sharing with, whether that be intelligence or military based. These are the kind of issues that come out, and Huawei is doing things to protect themselves. What are they doing? They really stockpiling their supply chain to make sure that they can kind of withhold and withstand some of these sanctions and some of these issues that will arise until they can create and have more of that semiconductor and also some of that higher equipment or better technology made at home. And this is, the Bloomberg News group put together a really good breakdown when we start looking at some of the different components. And when we look at semiconductor production, the industry is divided into those three main areas. So there's the fabless, the foundry, and then the outsourced semiconductor assembly and testing. So design, obviously, it's what we have to think about, design. That's the R&D, as we talked about, the research and development, which was made in China 2025. How do we get people back into China in order to have the research and development happen in-house? But people want to get rich on what they create. So now you have protection of IP, you have, but at the same time, income distribution, because as we'll talk about, they're starting to go after some of these tech juggernauts within China. And even though for some reason the indices don't reflect it, they are going after them, Alibaba being one of the bigger. But that's the biggest component, is create things in-house, not rely on getting a key component from Japan or a key component from the US. Now, manufacturing, you have to take these designs and then you have to make them. Again, this is something that they've been trying to do and increasing over time. Made in China 2025, bring in the silica, bring in the manganese, bring in the steel, or I should say iron ore, coal, make the steel, and have everything in-house. But then the testing and assembly, like when you look at the U.S., we will export semi-finished goods, import final product. They want everything to happen in-house. And there's a lot of reasons why we are very careful with who we give the ability to test and see the final product, because some of these final products may be sensitive. They may be behind privacy laws, or they may be behind some sort of restriction based on the government. You have to have a certain clearance to see that chip because it's going into highly sensitive materials. So these are things that when we look at the materials in terms of not only testing but also the installation and the total component. So this is what's driving their views and why we want to look at, okay, well, where's the industry choke point? Where is there something that China is trying to get away from, or at least increase? And you can see the U.S. obviously has a significant amount of things that are in-house. Now, some of these components where you might say, well, Intel's everywhere. You might say Broadcom's everywhere, and it's true. There are going to be pieces with very sensitive materials that are going to be with allies. And that's why we try to cap that. Europe is obviously one of them. Taiwan is another. South Korea is another that has some of this technology. Asia, obviously, as you can see, South Korea and Taiwan are big. China's fairly small. And the idea is, how do you get China to be in that bigger level to help get out and break out of those components? Because China remains, they're looking at this and saying, how do we close this gap? You could say take over Hong Kong, take over Taiwan. We could go down that route, which probably is more truth than not. But when we start looking at this is what is really going to drive their investments as we look at maintaining and really creating something that's within their borders. And when we start to look at, okay, well, what is happening in tech? Why, they want to empower tech stocks, they want to empower tech companies, but they still have a communist bent. They still have that socialist setup. And let's get away from socialism and just call it what it is, which is communism. And they don't want monopolies. They don't want these huge individuals to have, or at least corporations to have, this kind of power. And they have gone after Alibaba specifically as they've started to trend into the financial world and trying to bring tech into finance. And these are those issues that we're continuing to see. And I think they're going to get worse. They're going to continue those restrictions, try to pull some of that back to the party level, help diversify. But at the same time, remember, income distribution. That is why that last statement is very important. Income distribution. How do you distribute the income and mitigate some of this flow? And that's something that is going to be a bigger focus over time as we continue to look at China, which remains, I think, the biggest elephant in the room, especially after what happened in Hong Kong, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when we look at the shifting emphasis, so as we look at the DCS, or again, that dual circulation strategy, what is the key message? And this chart on the right, I think, is really important to look at, how the messages have changed. So obviously innovation is now paramount. It remains paramount, but everyone knows that. So that started to kind of drop out of that lexicon as we start to look at what are those key messages. But we're starting to see income, green, domestic demand. And the domestic demand is the bigger component as to the DCS model as we start to look at, well, how are we going to get that domestic demand? You know, consumption's fairly flat, obviously the bigger component, but that domestic demand is the issue. They want the local consumer to be the driver. And that hasn't happened yet. That's still been very slow. And we've seen that through COVID as we start to look at the export-import backdrop. Obviously, technology. Technology is a huge component of, again, linking all of this together. But as we look out, as we've talked about India and China, as we've talked about Taiwan, as we talked about Hong Kong, obviously, if you're watching this and you know me, I'm not a huge fan of China. I think there are a lot of issues that we can talk about and go deeper into what are their underlying goals. And when we start looking at security and national defense, they continue to move higher and higher as they look out. And even with the shift in presidency, we're still going to continue to see pain and pressure overall. And this is also going to drive them. They don't want us, or I should say the US or Europe, to have the ability to turn off a key component that they need to build a missile, to build an additional ship or aircraft. And they're focusing now more on national defense and other as we see tensions continuing to get ratcheted up. And just based on the trajectory, which as I've highlighted, I can post it again in the comments, where I go through my views and how it all started back in Tiananmen Square and how we've been on a downward trajectory with, obviously there's always ebbs and flows, but the move is heading in one direction. And which is why, as I've said before, whether Trump or Hillary Clinton won the election, we were heading for a Cold War. And I don't think a Biden presidency would really be able to stop that as the issues continue to mount and the evidence mounts against China and what their actions are and what their ambitions are. So when we look at the U.S. has a dependence on foreign trade of about 26.4%, which is 9 percentage points lower than that of China. Again, mitigating that dependence, but that does not prevent the U.S. from being a major global trading country and major power utilizing foreign investment and conducting outbound investment. Again, they're trying to be the U.S. They want to take a book out of our page and really try to create that to become more like the U.S., even though we have our own issues of that case. And again, coming to those key components, China must control critical technologies and assure that the security. And I can't stress enough, China must protect consumers' rights and build an environment conducive to consumption. That is the key structure that really needs to be driven home. And this is why when we start looking at, China's trade, let's look at Chinese trade. Let's look at exports, imports. Exports continue to the upside, but as we've been highlighting, imports were down. That comes back to the import surge was driven not really by consumption, but based on stuff coming into the market ahead of sanctions. And that was Huawei, because when we look at what was imported, it was a lot of tech. It was a lot of materials that are important for the technological side, which is, again, trying to build that buffer to mitigate against additional sanctions, and that pushed the trade balance kind of back to where it was overall. And in our bigger report, we have kind of that backdrop as, how did things look in trade when we go to through an Obama presidency, a Trump presidency, and now what we're trying to project into a potential Biden presidency. So here, the bigger view, and this is what we want to talk about with Australia, is that despite the escalating trade dispute with Australia, which will continue to escalate, China issuing unofficial bans on Australian goods from wine, timber, barley, coal, as we've talked about. And it actually, but even though they did that, the bilateral trade actually increased. So Chinese exports to Australia rose 16.6% from a year earlier to $5.25 billion US dollars, while imports from Australia rose 6.64% to $10.11 billion. So you could say this is one of two things. One, it's all for show, and they're going back and forth, or they're trying to amass a certain amount of inventory prior to escalation. And that's something that we have to watch and look at how the rhetoric is shifting. And I think China and Australia are also trying to feel out, well, what is the Biden presidency going to look like? How can we expect to see support or additional pressure? And just based on the bilateral deals that we've seen throughout the Obama administration, it was more about cordoning off China and trying to unite the different areas, which we saw increase or at least continue under a Trump presidency across across India, Vietnam, Australia, Philippines, and obviously Taiwan, as we are now openly saying that we have Marines that are training Taiwanese soldiers. We've sold them Harpoon missiles. We've sold them additional equipment, and we're more open with how we interact with Taiwan. That's something where we might see a shift in terms of maybe not being as open about it, but I don't see the support really getting pulled back even under a Biden presidency. So just to kind of round out before we go into the next component is, when we look at chips, again, coming back to semiconductors, China imported about $306 billion worth of microchips. It can be said that many multinational companies such as Qualcomm, Intel could not have grown to their present size without Chinese demand. So this is China's pushback, saying, look, you need us anyway, so stop this fight. But again, both sides kind of see what's happening, and there's concern on what the future holds. Now the U.S. cut off supply, but our market demand still exists. This provides a rare opportunity for domestic chip companies. So again, as those issues continue to rise up, which again, I don't see changing under a Biden presidency, but again, we'll wait for more information. So 3 domestic policy issues moving up the priority ladder. Again, looking at what does the plenum look like? What does that mean going forward? Innovation, technology, self-reliance, again, coming back to the main focus, boosting incomes, reducing inequality, but the expansion of national security regime in economic and social affairs. Again, back to the national security component. And then G, rounded it out. In recent years, as the trend of anti-globalization has intensified, some countries have practiced unilateralism and protectionism, and the traditional international economic cycle has been significantly weakened. Under such circumstances, we must rely more on the domestic market to achieve economic development. Again, kind of summarizing, that's a quote, again, coming from Trivium, which is coming from, obviously, President Xi. Now, when we look at, even though all of this rhetoric is happening, China continues to expand its global share of high-tech exports because they're still trying to kind of build that up. They still don't have the domestic demand consumption, so they're still exporting it. Now, high-tech exports mean a lot of different things. They still assemble a lot of stuff for the U.S., which is being adjusted, being moved. We've seen investment in Vietnam. We've seen investments elsewhere. But this is a bigger component as we look overall, and as high-tech exports versus total exports continue to maintain this 30, let's call it 29 to 30%, which they've really achieved since 2014. And this is going to be the bigger component as we go forward as to what does their economics really look like. But again, the issue is increasing the consumption at home. So now just kind of rounding it out and just giving some quotes and some key research areas that we're going to continue to touch on as we start to look at, how is a Biden presidency going to address some of these different functions. The document pledged strengthen the protection of intellectual properties and greatly improve the efficacy of scientific and technological achievement, increase investment in research and development, improve the mechanism of government investment. Again, improve government investment. So they still want to open up companies, but they still want the government to have a hand in where is this all being directed. And that's, again, increased support of basic research. So again, government is always going to be embedded in a lot of these decisions in a lot of these companies going forward. Recommendations of research areas. Again, this is something that would apply to any country. Artificial intelligence, quantum information, integrated circuits, life and health science, neuroscience, biological breeding, aerospace technology. Nothing surprising in that level. But again, that's something that we've heard not only from China, but from other countries. But what's specific to China? Improve the management of negative lists for foreign investments. So trying to get more foreign investment, but again, from key players that will be friendlier to the Chinese dream. Further open up the service industry to foreign investment, protect the legitimate rights and interests of foreign investments, again, IP. And the document also promised that Beijing will protect the legitimate rights of Chinese firms overseas. Again, that's a shot across the bow talking about Huawei and what happened with TikTok and what's going to continue to happen with some of these entities within foreign nations. Again, these are all, and as Trivium described, a perhaps not so subtle nod to the recent scrutiny faced by Chinese companies in the U.S. These are issues that are going to continue to rise up, and they're not going away. They will only get worse. The party is keenly aware that bureaucracy and policy drag on, removing systematic barriers. Again, trying to remove barriers, but insert government, but remove barriers. I know. It's funny to hear it out loud. And promoting market-oriented reforms to land, labor, capital. Again, these are things that are going to continue and we have to watch for. And technological and data started appearing on policymaker lists starting in May. So this is something that, if you've been reading our research, watching our videos, none of this is surprising. It's just now written in stone. It is now put into the Congress. This is what we need to look at. And that DCS model, that dual circulation strategy, is going to become the new buzzword, where we had BRI, then we had Made in China 2025, and now it all culminates in that DCS strategy. And we're just at the beginning of understanding it, and expect more from us in terms of what does this mean for what's happening abroad. We saw in Hong Kong, there has been a resignation of all the pro-democratic people in the House. And it's just because they're coming after them. If you've been shown to show any kind of support, that means that you're going to continue to struggle, and they're essentially going to come for you. So again, this is just another means of protest, which will only pick up, which we'll cover next week as we go more into the geopolitical, as we start to look at how this all integrates a bit deeper in some of these different levels throughout the rest of the world.